dedicate a whole season to exploring trade, the modern history, where U.S. trade policy fell short, and the Trump administration's agenda. For our final episode, we wanted to answer your questions, this time with CFR President Michael Froman and Head of Studies Shannon O'Neill. Will China gain from this moment? Can manufacturing jobs come back to the U.S.? Has the United States risked valuable alliances because of the Trump administration's tariff policy? For our conversation about this historic moment, we take you to our headquarters in New York. So, hello.
Hi there.
Welcome to the Why It Matters season finale of our all trade season. So to start, I just sort of wanted to ask how you both decided to wake up one morning and get into trade as part of, what you do day to day.
Well, mine was sort of accidental. I initially started working on U.S.-Soviet relations and arms control and negotiations. And then the Cold War ended. I thought, gee, I've been studying negotiations. What's another area of negotiations I should pivot to? And trade was it. So that's how I got started. I'm very grateful to President Trump for making trade great again, because there was a period of time when it was very hard to get reporters to cover trade, to write articles on trade, because they thought it was boring. Of course, they were wrong. Mm-hmm. And now everyone is becoming the trade expert, and it's front page news.
I would say it's when I started working, I was living abroad and I was watching the back and forth. I was living first in Mexico, later in Argentina. And, what was really important was its relation to the United States. It was sort of the rise of China. All of a sudden you were seeing all this movement, and it fascinated me. This is how economies grow or don't. I would also say was growing up, I grew up in the state of Ohio, and you saw when I was younger, factories closing, but also friends of my family having businesses where they were going out and trying to find customers in other places. So I was watching it happen in kind of a smaller city in the Midwest, the good and the bad of it. And I think that kind of spurred me to be interested in what was this all about and why did it matter?
That was definitely one of my favorite parts of the season, is getting to speak to people who were directly involved, people that Matt Goodman had met on his listening tour and connected us with, who were working in factories, who ran their dog gelato business, and were really telling us how directly this has affected them and could affect them in the future. So it's really been very, very interesting. So that all being said, where are we today compared to where we were when we sort of kicked all of this off at the beginning of the year? What do we see has changed? What stayed the same? And maybe what surprised you? Mike, I don't know if you want to kick us off.
Well, first, I think people often say that President Trump is unpredictable. But when it comes to trade, he's been pretty consistent. It goes back to 1987, long before he was involved in politics. He was speaking out against trade, was very concerned about the trade deficits that we were running with other countries. And we've seen that now manifest itself in policy. A lot has happened in the last 3.5, 4 months that on the trade front, very disruptive to the global trading system. We previously had a rules-based system where everyone agreed to what the tariff would be that they would apply to everybody else. It was a negotiated solution. Some had higher tariffs on some products and lower tariffs on others. And President Trump has come in and said, nope, we have this trade deficit with a lot of countries. We're going to set at least a benchmark tariff and reciprocal tariffs on top of that, and tariffs on particular products, sensitive products like steel and aluminum, cars on top of that. And then with certain countries in particular, we're going to even go further. And so that has fundamentally changed the landscape of the international trading system.
Yeah, I would just add, trade is one of those places that's been pretty sleepy, right? Negotiations take months, years, really, to get to some kind of fruition, if they get to fruition at all. Then sometimes they take more years to ratify after everybody signs them. So it's been a kind of a slow moving, and just in the last 3 months, you've seen huge shifts. And I would say these shifts are, at least some of them, even though all of the uncertainty, they're here to stay. Right? We have fundamentally changed the way we think about trade here in the United States, the kind of policies coming from the United States, and the rest of the world is reacting. They have policies too that they're beginning to put in place that may or may not include the United States. So I think this is an area from a kind of sleepy, much slower policy area. It's become one of the fastest moving ones. And I think, as we look at 2025 going forward, I think it's going to continue to be so.
Agree.
What about surprises? Anything that surprised you?
I think there'd be two surprises. One is that the United States moved so fast, so hard in so many ways, in ways that sometimes, at least to me, don't seem to make sense, right? Is there really a national security threat around trade with Canada and Mexico, for instance, things like that? But the other thing that sort of surprised me, perhaps, is how other parts of the world have reacted. And we've seen all kinds of reactions. Some people have come to the United States and let's sign anything to kind of get back to where we were before. But other countries are starting to move in other directions and say, you know what? I'm going to go look at other countries. This is not somewhere where I can rely. I'm going to move on and start finding other kinds of trading partners, but other ways of doing business, frankly. So I think it's open all around the world, not just with the United States, but more broadly.
Are there any grains of truth to what this administration says was an issue with U.S. trade?
I do think there are areas there, and at least they've uncovered some of these areas. For instance, in the news just this week is the fact that we don't have rare earth magnets made here in the United States. And there's a real worry. In fact, we may see shortages in the days and weeks to come because China has slowed, if not stopped, effectively the exports out of China, where most all of them are made. So this trade policy where you start seeing ratcheting up of tariff levels, of the cost of bringing things back and forth, you see reactions from countries like China. It's showing some of these weaknesses. So there is something there. We should make things like these magnets, but other things that pertain to our national security, right? To defense, to other things that really affect our day-to-day lives. We should make those either here in the United States or in places that we think will continue to send them to us, even if we tend to get into, we have frustrations or we get into disputes. And what we found just in these last couple of weeks or months is that that's not China, at least on this issue. So I do think there's some things that we've uncovered, at least with this, new trade policy that are important for the U.S. economy.
I also think the Trump administration has been correct to focus on areas where other countries have more trade barriers to our exports than we have to theirs. We're a relatively open economy, not perfectly so, but our tariff rates are pretty low. Our non-tariff barriers are pretty transparent and relatively low. Other countries have a lot more. And so the intuition that the president has of trying to level the playing field, now in this case, he's leveling them up rather than down. There was a hope that he would say, okay, great, let's go for zero tariffs on both sides. But now instead, we're likely to end up with a 10% or even higher tariff facing the rest of the world. And conceivably, we'll have retaliation against the United States as well. And that'll make it a less efficient economy, more expensive. That's a little bit of a surprise, too. The president came in having run a campaign against people's concern about the cost of living and inflation.
Right.
And these actions are all inherently inflationary. They're going to make the consumer goods that people buy more expensive. They're going to make the inputs that domestic manufacturers buy from other countries more expensive and put pressure on them. And some of them are likely to go out of business or have business trouble. So that's a little bit surprising, too, that he's taken a path that is going to cause quite a bit of pain for the foreseeable future on the hope that at some point it leads to more manufacturing moving back to the United States.
I mean, you kind of alluded to this, but what in the Trump administration's policy isn't adding up? Where do you see Trump's trade policy clashing with itself? I mean, you really just said one, and with U.S. national security goals.
Well, I think the inflationary issue is one, but I also think in so many areas, we need our allies and partners to achieve other objectives that we have, including in the national security area. So whether it's alliances or whether it's cooperation around export controls, we're trying to constrain the export of advanced semiconductor technology to China. That's a priority of this administration, as it was of the last administration. To do that, we need the cooperation of Japan, of Korea, of the Netherlands. And these are all countries that are now facing a trade war with the United States or increased tariffs from the United States. And they have their own domestic politics. And when it comes for time for the U.S. to go and ask them for what appears to be a favor, now maybe it's not really a favor because national security is in their interest too, but it's requiring them to make a sacrifice of some sort by not exporting some technology they have. The question is, over the long run, will we have damaged our relationships in such a way that this tariff policy may actually make it more difficult for us to achieve other important objectives?
Yeah, let me add to Mike. I mean, one part is that side of national security. The other is if we have ambitions to make many of these things here, in the end, we're going to have to do it in a commercially viable way. I think it's very hard to imagine the United States government indefinitely subsidizing a whole host of industries. And to do so, if you're going to compete with global markets, you're going to need to have partners in other countries. You're going to need to have production have global supply chains in some way, shape, or form. They may not touch on countries like China or others that we see as adversaries, but they will need to be across countries, because otherwise you're just not going to have sort of the economies of scale or scope, the affordability and the high quality of the pieces and parts that go into cars and machinery and medical devices and pharmaceuticals, all the kinds of medicines that we have, and a whole host of other things if we try to do it just by ourselves. So if we want to be part of that market, we're going to have other allies. And it's hard to do if you're putting tariffs on all of them at the moment.
The previous administration, the Biden administration, focused on friendshoring. That if we don't produce it here, at least we could produce it in friendly countries, Mexico, Canada, Europe, Japan. I mean, some of these are military allies. This administration appears to say, no, there's certain things we have to produce just in the United States. And to Shannon's point, that may be impossible with certain products because we just don't have the inputs themselves, or it may be so expensive that it's not economically viable, and that doesn't create a good foundation for national security either.
So then who has benefited most from Trump's trade policy?
Well, it's early days, and we still don't actually know what the policy is,
Feels
right?
like it's been forever.
But it changes every few days.
Yes. You don't know if it's a 10% tariff, you don't know if it's a 50% tariff, and then it really depends on who it will benefit. I mean, it should benefit manufacturers of goods that are just in the United States. But as Mike pointed out earlier, most people that manufacture in the United States, they import things into the United States. You know, they import everything from the energy that powers their plants to various inputs, components, you know, whatever that is. And so their prices are going up. It's also, as prices go up, as inflation, as we've talked about, goes up, American consumers will buy less of each thing. And so there may be less demand for their products. So it's really hard to tell. But what we may end up seeing, I would say, is if this all plays out and tariffs stay in place to some way, shape, or form, what we may end up seeing is those who are producing in the United States for the United States, you have a protected market. You can actually make pretty good margins because you'll be able to charge more to Americans than you'd be able to charge in global markets. So there will be sort of, you know, an America for America kind of policy. You could see people benefiting.
I think more generally, I think China benefits the most right now. Not in a direct economic sense, but I think because the U.S. is being viewed as being so disruptive to the system, it's sort of let China off the hook. You know, for years, for decades, the U.S. was the defender of the global rules-based system, which gave it the ability to point to China and other countries in the past and say they're pursuing a set of policies that are undermining those rules. Now it's hard for us to do that because all the focus is on us. You know, people have sort of adjusted to China. They're still pursuing a lot of those policies, but they're viewing the United States as the one who's being the disruptor.
Sure.
And that giving China sort of a buy on this.
How have the policies changed domestic industries and jobs? We alluded to it a little bit, but is there a domestic demand for the manufacturing jobs Trump wants to bring back? Or is there a different form of, re-onshoring we should take?
Look, I think it's too early to tell. It's still early days. I think what we do know is that we have about 500,000 manufacturing job openings that have not been filled yet. And there's a real question of what does it take to fill those jobs? And the perception of the administration is these are the jobs we want to multiply, and there will be workers there for it. That's their hope. We haven't seen that yet. You know, every coal miner wants their child to go work at the airport, where it's a cleaner, safer job for somebody of similar education levels. It's a service job. And the question is whether we're going to see this great influx of people, of workers who want to go into the kind of manufacturing that we're likely to see. The other thing is that to the degree that the Trump administration is successful in driving more manufacturing to the United States, it's likely to be pretty automated. It's likely to have a lot of robotics, a lot of automation, and less actual job creation around that. And so, again, we won't know the results for 3, 4, 5, 6 years down the road, but it'll be interesting to see whether it actually produces more high-paying jobs, which is what the administration hopes to see, or whether we have more production, but not that many more jobs.
Yeah, I just add, right now the U.S. economy is at pretty close to full employment. So if you're going to increase the jobs in manufacturing, you're going to have to pull them from other sectors. So other sectors will shrink potentially if you're successful in increasing manufacturing jobs, particularly if you don't have an expansive immigration policy, right? If you're not bringing in people from other countries to expand that labor market, there are going to be some shifts that we would have to see.
Historically, there was this manufacturing premium. So workers got paid more to be in manufacturing than in services. Very recently, that has sort of flipped and the premium has gone down. And in fact, service jobs on average now pay more than manufacturing jobs. So part of the reason is we just want more manufacturing in the country because we think any great country needs to have a strong manufacturing base, whether it's for national security or because it has all sorts of innovation, spillover effects that come out of the manufacturing sector. That's one reason. If the other reason is to have more well-paying jobs, sort of like we had in the 1950s and 60s, there's a bit of a romantic notion about that, then that may be challenged if we're now finding that actually service jobs pay more and the manufacturing jobs are likely to be few and far between.
I know that a lot of our experts have pointed to the need for training as part of this. Has that been a focus at all?
Not as much as I would hope.
Okay.
This is a huge issue that has been around for a long time. And I think both Republican and Democratic administrations never really invested as much in figuring out what it takes to help support workers thrive in a rapidly changing economy. Whether that change is coming from automation and technology or from immigration or from trade. Most economists think that about 80% of job disruption comes from technology. But some does come from trade and from globalization. At the government level, we've never had adequate programs. And the question is, can we learn from other countries? Can we learn from having private sector-led programs that could really instill the notion of lifelong learning so that a worker at 25 years old is going to have to learn a lot of different things over his or her lifetime in a rapidly changing economy? Do we have the capacity for that to happen?
And maybe healthcare. Right, that's a big part of it too.
Childcare, there's a lot in the social safety net that would make it easier for a wide range of workers to participate.
What about the choice between us and China as a trading partner? Do you see this administration as effective in calling out China for not actually adhering to the rules-based order?
We have seen them calling them out, right? There's a lot of, actually all around, there's a lot of name calling that's happening. But what we have not seen is coming together to face a non-market-based economy, which is China. There are lots of subsidies, there are lots of involvement in the state, there's lots of state-owned enterprises. There's a lot of manipulating of markets and the like that have benefited Chinese companies both at home, so competing, so US or European or other international companies that are in the Chinese market, but particularly in the global markets, right? What's sent out into the world. And China, in particular, over these last few years, has really sent out hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods in all kinds of sectors into global markets at very low prices. So the challenge, I think, for the current policy is if you're fighting with everyone, it's very hard to bring that coalition together to protect a market-based economy from a non-market-based economy. And that's, I think, where we are right now. Now, whether or not countries will have to choose between the United States and China, that is a big question. There is talk of that, but again, it's hard to get countries to come together on that if you're also fighting with them on other aspects. And then I think the final question is, when you're asking them to choose, what are you asking them to choose about? Are you asking them to choose about everything so they can't import socks from China and, textiles or furniture? Or do you really care about things that are important for national security? You care about telecommunications connections? Do you care about, manufacturing in other particular strategic sectors, aviation, or maybe medicines and medical devices, things that are really important for the survival and prosperity of populations? And there I just see very muddied waters. It's unclear. One day it's everything, other days it's actually specific sectors.
And I think it's unclear what it is this administration wants from China. Is it for China to change its economic strategy and its economic policies that Shannon referred to, creating this excess capacity and driving growth only through exports in a way that has a predatory effect on other countries? Or is it just to buy more of our stuff? In the first Trump administration, the phase one trade agreement that they negotiated was basically an agreement, a purchase and sale agreement for them to buy more soybeans, more liquefied natural gas, a few other products. it was not about fundamentally changing the Chinese economy. And it's unclear yet at this point, because there's very little negotiation going on to date, what it is we're going to get out of China.
What is the risk of this administration focusing too much on the trade deficit?
Well, it is. This president is very focused on the trade deficit, views it as sort of a scorecard, that if we export less goods to another country than they export to us, that we're losing and they're winning. The economy is more complicated from that. First of all, there's only been a focus on goods when 80% of our economy is services. And we tend to have a services trade surplus, not a deficit with most countries. And so when you take into account all of our trade, we actually have a much more balanced relationship than one might assume, given the position of the administration. It's also, it goes to the fundamental notion of comparative advantage in economics. We can't produce everything ourselves. We want to be able to rely on other countries who may do it better or cheaper than we can and use it as an input into our economy. And for some countries, that means we'll be running a deficit, and in some countries, we'll be running a surplus. I think the administration is right to focus on if there are obstacles to our exports that are contributing to the trade deficit, then let's address those obstacles. But most economists will tell you that the trade deficit means that we might be buying more goods, but that means other countries are investing more in the United States, that there's a current account surplus along with the trade deficit, and that is a balance. And we want the rest of the world to be buying our debt, investing in our stock market, investing in our companies, creating businesses here in the United States. That's good for us. And so it's a little bit more complicated than I think the administration has suggested.
Yeah, I would just add to that. It's also, I think the view is that there's just a fixed amount of wealth in the world and that the pie is not going to grow. So you want to get a bigger part of that pie. But, if we can grow that pie, sure, maybe other countries get a bigger part of that bigger slice, but we get a part of that new slice as well. And so there can be a rising tide lifts all boats rather than just a zero-sum, tit for tat. I think the other thing is, one of the fastest, easiest ways to bring down a trade deficit is to go into recession.
Right.
To have everybody worse off.
Right?
And who wants that?
That doesn't sound good.
Yeah. So if that's your only measure of success, it could lead you down a dangerous path.
Well, Mike, your firsthand experience as a former trade rep leads me to ask this question. If you were Trump's trade rep, what advice would you give him? Or maybe what advice would you give the current trade rep himself? Well,
look, I think to go back to one of your questions, I think one of the challenges this administration has created for itself is the inconsistency from day to day. And if you believe the theory that if we put up a wall of tariffs, other companies will move their production to the United States, that only works if the companies feel like those tariffs are stable and expected and anticipated for a long period of time. Because those decisions to allocate capital away from efficient supply chains and to the United States instead, those are big decisions. They're going to take years for companies to make. And they can't make those decisions if tariffs are changing week by week, hour by hour sometimes. And so one piece of advice would be figure out what the strategy is, articulate it clearly, and then be consistent about it, not change it from one day to another. I think another is perhaps focus less on the trade deficits and more on what the trade obstacles are. And thirdly, really have a serious discussion about the trade-offs between efficiency and national security. How much more are we willing to pay for all of our goods to have greater national security in certain areas? The trade-offs are always implicit in everything we do, so it's pretty important to actually make them explicit and have a conversation. How much is the American public willing to pay more for everything coming in from China, for T-shirts, for sneakers, for back-to-school items, in order to isolate China or decouple from China on a few technologies that are particularly important to national security. And those conversations aren't really being had at the moment.
Right. Can you convince people to not do their big Shein haul of clothing?
I think when you ask the American public, are you willing to pay something for national security, or are you willing to pay more to have more manufacturing jobs in the United States? I think most Americans will say yes. But when you actually look at consumer behavior, the behavior is not necessarily following in that way. And so the risk is that we go down a path assuming that the American public is willing to do this, and then at the end of the day, they're not, and they're unhappy with the results. And this, I think, is a real challenge for the administration from its perspective, trying to put myself in their shoes. Globalization created a dynamic where everybody benefited as a consumer from having efficient production around the world. And the costs of globalization, along with automation and the other factors, were acutely felt by a relatively small number of workers, a couple million. They're not a small number, but relative to all the consumers in the United States, in a small number of geographies. So, Ohio, the steel mills, the auto sector, some of the auto parts, these are sectors that felt the effect of globalization. Now the president has flipped it on its head, and everyone's going to feel the cost of moving back from globalization. They're going to see everything be more expensive in their life. And the benefits, if he's successful, if he's right about the theory, will come 4, 6, 8 years from now and will benefit a relatively small number of workers in a relatively small number of geographies. That's a really difficult political dynamic for anybody to manage, where everybody's feeling pain and the benefits go to relatively few.
So it's hard to believe that so much has happened in just over 130 days. How do you see Trump's projected image as being a deal maker playing out over the next 4 years?
I mean, there'll be a lot of deals made and maybe a lot of deals broken. And, I think the challenge for this administration, which we're seeing in sort of the financial press and the like, is, are there really any deals to be made, right? There's a moniker going around called the taco trade, right? Is that Trump always chickens out. And so a worry that even though there are gambits put on the table, that they'll quickly be walked back without actually any deals being made. And some of the court rulings, some of the other changes we've seen just in the last couple of weeks also make it really hard to know what you're negotiating against. So are there going to be deals made over the next 4 years? Sure, uncertainly. There are going to be a lot of deals. The question is, how long lasting will be those deals? Both because of, changes here in the United States, courts and markets and the like, or perhaps just changes in Trump's administration and Trump's own mind about what he actually wants in the end. So I think real lasting deals that make a difference for good or bad or other in the economy, in our politics, in sort of global diplomacy will be, few and far between.
I think the administration is also coming to terms that some of this stuff is harder than they expected. The Ukraine-Russia deal that was supposed to be done in 24 hours or a few months or a month, now they've said if we don't reach a deal soon, we're going to walk away. The deal in the ceasefire in the Middle East, more difficult. A deal with Iran. We have some principles that dealt with everything except the enrichment of uranium. So, lots of difficult issues, which is why it has traditionally taken, more time to get these kinds of deals done. In addition to obviously now having 90 or 160 trade deals to negotiate with other countries, they take time to do right, and there can be sort of agreements in principle, but the devil is always in the detail, and I think they're beginning to come to terms with that as well.
So before we wrap up, we wanted to give our listeners a chance to ask some of their burning questions about trade. We reached out on social media to hear from you, and we received tons of responses. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to them all today, but we have a select few that we're going to run through. And I'll kick off that we got a lot of questions about the recent court ruling on Trump's tariffs. On May 28th, the U.S. Court of International Trade declared Trump's sweeping tariffs on imported goods to be illegal. This was big news. The tariffs set by Trump on nearly all countries have been the cause of a lot of uncertainty for U.S. consumers and business owners. So at Manali20098 asks, will the Trump administration adhere to this ruling?
Well, good question. Right? They are appealing it. They have appealed it, and they'll continue to appeal it as far as they need to, I would say. But the other thing is, even if they can't use this particular, Emergency Powers Act to put in tariffs, they have lots of other mechanisms that they've used in the past and that they're already using this time. So there's a whole host of numbers, 232 and 301 and 122 and a whole kinds of other numbers. But what those boil down to is they can put tariffs on sectors. So they can put it on automotive and steel and aluminum, which they've already done. And they have a lot of other things on semiconductors and pharmaceuticals and heavy trucks and others that are in the works already. They can put it on countries for unfair practices. They can put it on countries who have balance of payments issues, so differences in trade deficits and current account deficits and the like. So there are a whole host of tools that they can use as backup if they can't use this particular tool. The benefit of this tool is they could use it right away on day one, and they could change it. They could go from 20% tariffs to 100% tariffs to 50% tariffs to wherever they wanted. These other ones, you have to do investigations. You have a little bit more of a process, but they're also stickier, and courts in the past have upheld them, so would likely, I would say, uphold them today.
And I think what it points to is that while the president has a lot of authority generally, trade is a little tricky because in the Constitution, it says Congress has the right to set tariffs.
Right.
Over the years, Congress has delegated elements of that authority to the executive under certain conditions, like 301, 232, 122. So those conditions that require process and public comment and review, and including review by the courts. And this administration was trying to do a shortcut by saying, let's use the emergency powers. It requires no process, total executive action. And the court said, hold up, that one piece of authority may not be available to you. We'll see. The president may prevail on appeal because there tends to be a lot of deference to the president when it comes to engaging in foreign policy and things of that sort. But this also may be a reassertion of the role of Congress and of the courts in broader trade policy and may require the administration to pivot, not necessarily away from tariffs, as Shannon says, but to other authorities that they have that may take more time and require them to be more thoughtful.
So a little bit like raptors testing the fences here, seeing which
Finding
one
the
will
lead part.
At Christian I. Oliver asks, has the flip-flopping on tariffs damaged U.S. credibility when we negotiate new trade deals?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, I think, first of all, pulling out of agreements that have been signed, like the JCPOA with Iran or TPP earlier in the first Trump administration, has damaged U.S. credibility in terms of a negotiating partner. And then I think the constant change of tariffs has made it difficult for other countries to take the difficult steps, the domestically difficult steps for them to address trade obstacles, protectionism, et cetera. So we're making it harder for other countries, and it's undermining our credibility in the meantime.
You agree?
I agree.
At Alex.Nicolazzo asks, what will be the long-term consequences of Trump's approach to trade? And I'll add on to that and ask, what should we be looking out for or expecting in the future?
I think the longer-term consequences are that the United States, while it will always be an attractive market, it's the biggest consumer market in the world, that other countries will start looking for other places. And companies will look for other markets than the United States, because this market will either be too expensive to get into, at least for some of their production. It won't be a place to base your factories that you might want to export from, because there will be tariffs or cost into the rest of the world. So yes, the United States will remain very important for sure, and people will come here and invest here to sell to US consumers, but it will leave other countries less sure of the United States and the rules around US trade, but it will also have them looking elsewhere. And in fact, we already see other countries laying the groundwork for this. You know, you look at this last decade, it was really a decade of lots of free trade agreements signed all around the world, right? We have CPTPP, which brings together over a dozen nations. We have RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is an Asia-based group. We see Africa coming together in a trade agreement. And the European Union is out there signing agreements with South America, with the UAE, potentially with India. Mm-hmm. Others are out there making deals that the United States is not part of. And that, in the long term, will change the prices for trade with other countries that won't benefit the United States.
You know, I think we're likely to be in a world that is less efficient, more expensive, more fragmented. Some of that's, I think, by the way, called for. I think we became overly complacent about relying so much on China as the world's manufacturing floor, so much on Taiwan for the supply of production of semiconductors. And you know, the number one rule of risk management for any company or country is diversification, right? You don't want to have all your eggs in one basket. So some of this was called for. But the reality is we're going to find ourselves facing a much more expensive, much more fragmented world. And the question will be, if we've taken apart the rules-based system that has served us generally pretty well for the last 80 years, not perfectly, but generally pretty well, what is it going to be replaced by? Is it going to be every country doing their own thing, like the United States? Is there going to be a set of rules that groups of countries follow with or without the United States? And to Shannon's point, to what degree does that advantage us or disadvantage us? Ideally, we'd like to be at the table setting the rules of the road, not deferring that to China. When it comes to things like AI or data or the digital economy, all these new issues. And if we're not at the table and others are, long term, what's going to be the implication for us?
Well, about all those other issues, do you feel like all this focus on trade is really taking away or distracting from some of the other larger things that we should be discussing? I mean, you mentioned AI, climate, we mentioned Ukraine. I don't know, it feels like we're spending a lot of time on things like trade deficit while lots of other things going on around the world.
I mean, there are lots of other things going on in the world, and you mentioned some of them. And then some of them tend to get, at least in the past, included in broader trade negotiations. So around how do you raise the standards of labor around the world so we face a more level playing field? How do you raise environmental standards? How do you deal with climate? Some of these are other issues that have been dealt with in trade negotiations, and they're not being dealt with now. We're focused solely on tariffs, which is one piece of the trade picture, but not the whole piece.
Well, Mike, Shannon, thank you so much
for
joining me
us
today, walking through all of this. Really appreciate having you on Why It Matters.
Thank you.
It was great.
For resources used in this episode and more information, visit cfr.org/whyitmatters. If you ever have any questions or suggestions, please reach out to us. We love receiving email. You can use whyitmatters@cfr.org, or you can hit us up on X at @CFR_org. Why It Matters is a production of the Council on Foreign Relations. The opinions expressed on the show are that of the guests, not of CFR, which takes no institutional positions on matters of policy. This episode was produced by Molly McInerney and me, Gabrielle Sierra. Our sound designer is Marcus Zacharia. Our audio engineer is Todd Yeager, and our video producers are Adrian Vasquez de Velasco, Luke Rafferty, and Justin Schuster. Our theme music is composed by Carrie Torhuson. Extra special thanks go to Jeremy Sherlick, our director of video, for setting all of this up. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your audio. For Why It Matters, this is Gabrielle Sierra signing off. See you soon.
We have almost an $800 billion a year trade deficit. In short, chronic trade deficits are no longer merely an economic problem. They're a national emergency that threatens our security. We're the piggy bank that they just keeping. They take our jobs, they take our money, they don't respect us.
No one hears the word deficit and thinks, oh, that must be a good thing. I'd like one of those. Especially not anyone who's been listening to Trump discuss the United States deficit over the course of his second term as president. The trade deficit is a key part of what's driving Trump's global push for reciprocal tariffs on U.S. trading partners. And while economists disagree about how much deficits matter, there has been more discussion about solutions. From bringing back jobs from overseas, to producing more goods to export, to reforming the tax code for big U.S. corporations operating abroad. But, of course, as with most things in international relations, the truth of it all is far more complicated. And the solutions have little to do with making enemies of our trading partners. I'm Gabrielle Sierra, and this is Why It Matters. Today, we're talking about the trade deficit.
The trading gap shuffle, we're in a heap of trouble, doing the trading gap shuffle, yes sir!
You already sang this song. No, that was about the budget gap. This is the trading gap.
So, is a trade deficit necessarily a bad thing?
No, it's not necessarily a bad thing. A fast-growing country that is investing a lot and wants to live well while it's investing a lot because it's optimistic about its future and thinks it's going to have more income in the future will reasonably run a trade deficit and import some savings from the rest of the world so that it can invest more.
This is Brad Setzer. He's a senior fellow for CFR, focusing on global trade and capital flows. Brad has served as a senior advisor to the U.S. Trade Representative and as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Economic Analysis in the U.S. Treasury. In short, he has spent a lot of time thinking about the trade deficit.
So there are certainly times when a trade deficit makes some economic sense. I think there are more risks when a trade deficit is associated with a high level of consumption or a high level of public spending rather than a high level of investment. And there are risks when a trade deficit lasts for a very long time because deficits by their nature have to be financed. But not every deficit is bad.
It's probably not a surprise to hear this, but just like Madonna said, we are living in a material world, and we're importing most of it. Currently, the trade deficit in the United States is the largest in the world, standing at $1.2 trillion at the end of 2024. But this has been the case for decades, and ever since U.S. manufacturing moved overseas, American consumers began spending more of their income on imported goods. How would you explain the politics of the trade deficit to everyday Americans?
So you have two really different camps on this. And one camp says the trade deficit is like your family budget.
This is Heather Hurlbert. She's an associate fellow at Chatham House, a think tank based in London, and most recently served as chief of staff to former U.S. Trade Representative Katherine Tai.
And you, a country, can't spend more than you have. You shouldn't spend more than you have. So you shouldn't be buying more dolls than you earn money, for just to take something that was in the news recently.
Maybe the children will have $2 instead of $30, you know? And maybe the $2 will cost a couple of bucks more than they would normally.
There is another way of thinking about it that says actually households are households, and major continental powers with every kind of asset and every kind of need you can imagine are not households. And so it makes complete sense for us to run deficits in some areas and run surpluses in others. And some of it, frankly, even takes on a moral aspect in American culture. So one way of thinking about it is trade deficits represent jobs flowing out of the US and being taken away from Americans who want to do them. Another way of thinking about it is trade deficits represent a kind of moral failing in our addiction or excessive addiction to stuff and to buying lots of cheap stuff from overseas. You know, your grandparents may do without $50 and without plastic decor for every holiday. So you could make do without those things too. And then the third way of thinking about them is trade deficits are just an economic artifact, and they have no meaning in and of themselves. They're just one measure within a complex global economy in which you also have to take into account services and currency transactions.
So then why the big fuss? It just feels like there's been like alarm bells ringing all the time lately about this.
So for years, this view that the trade deficits had to balance out, or that manufacturing trade had to balance out, was kind of a fringe viewpoint.
If you just want to get down to brass tacks, first thing you ought to do is get all these folks who've got these one-way trade agreements that we've negotiated over the years and say, fellas, we'll take the same deal we gave you. And they'll gridlock right in.
It had been shoved to the side in the post-Cold War globalization. Again, the US dollar can be everybody else's currency, and there's so much demand for that there was much less concern over trade deficits. But President Trump has brought back to power folks who see that as much more centrally important. So what really changed in the conversation is the politics And the politics are now driving changes in the economics rather than the other way around.
I see. So you would definitely say the nuance is missing from this conversation.
This is just a terrible age for nuance. Nuance is following satire into the grave, is what I would say about this topic.
That's a great way, a great and depressing way to put it. What do you see missing from how policy officials are talking about the deficit?
So the thing that I think makes the solution so hard is that when we say trade, the actual exchange of goods and services between nations is kind of the least of what we're talking about. And we're talking a lot more about how Americans earn their livings, number one, and how deeply enmeshed we are with other countries, number two. And both of those are bigger, more complex, challenging phenomena than tariffs. And so tariffs, I mean, the president loves tariffs because they're easy to use and easy to understand. But it really, somewhat tragically, they don't, in the end of the day, get at the problems that we're trying to get at.
Look, President Trump just likes tariffs.
Most beautiful word in the English language. Yes.
I think he may like tariffs more than he cares about the trade deficit. I mean, he's articulated a bunch of different reasons why he likes tariffs, but certainly one of them is that he worries a lot about trade deficits in general, doesn't like them. He thinks they're evidence of unfairness. He thinks fair trade is balanced trade. And then he tends to think any bilateral deficit is evidence of unfairness on the part of our trading partners. Now, most economists would say bilateral trade deficits reflect a lot of different things and are a very unreliable gauge of whether trade is unfair. But for President Trump, any bilateral imbalance is, in his personal view, evidence of unfairness, and he's introduced tariffs that are based on that principle. There's not a lot of merit in putting tariffs on countries which have surpluses just with us. There are countries that run surpluses with us simply because they're too poor to afford our goods. We're rich. We sell the kind of goods that other rich countries want to buy, as a general matter. There are countries that run surpluses with us where the surplus is a reflection of a broader problem. I would say that's the case with China. I would actually say that's the case with Ireland, which is tied to tax, not so much trade. But as a general matter, putting tariffs on a country as a function of its bilateral surplus with the U.S., our bilateral deficit with them, is a bad policy in my view, and in the view of most economists.
At some level, you do sometimes get the sense with President Trump that it is all about who has more and who has less. And anytime you can document that the U.S. has less and someone else has more, that might mean that we're being taken advantage of. That might mean we're being played for a sucker. There's kind of a lot of just fantasy around that. I mean, trade deficits have been very stubborn under both Republican and Democratic presidents because it is much cheaper to make some things in other parts of the world where folks have much lower living standards and where folks earn less money and have, frankly, fewer job protections, health and safety protections. And that you can get at some of that with tariffs, but not all of it. And it's very unlikely that you're going to move all of those things back here. And so we actually have an environment where neither the folks who care about trade deficits as an economic matter, nor folks who genuinely want to move manufacturing back here are able to have a realistic conversation about what kinds of manufacturing can we move back here? What would it look like if we said, okay, high-end or very technically intense manufacturing, we can move back here. Again, like dolls and pencils and some of the things that have been cited recently, unlikely. Also, many high-end manufacturing jobs are now done by robots and require quite a bit of technical skills. So you want to create better jobs for Americans, you have to twin anything you're doing in the tariff space with investment in education, investment in tech training, incentives for factories to come and set up in a community, and a stable environment. And, right now, education, training, stable economic environment, we're kind of going the wrong way on all of those things. And the people who actually want the jobs, who want to live in their communities and have jobs that feel good and meaningful to them in their communities, they get left out of all of this at the end.
When does having a trade deficit become something that is harmful to a country's economy?
A trade deficit becomes a real problem first when it gets to be too big. Very few countries run trade deficits over 5% of GDP because that's just too big. And a trade deficit is clearly a problem if it corresponds to a boom in consumption, a lot of public borrowing, and not a boom in investment. And then finally, this gets kind of technical, but it's important. Trade deficits are much more problematic when a country has to borrow in some other country's currency. So the US can run bigger trade deficits than poorer countries because we can borrow in dollars. So I think it's a function of the size of the deficit, what you're borrowing for, and how you're financing it.
Let's think about this as if the US is a superhero. When it comes to the trade deficit, a common argument is that the US is protected by the Captain America shield of the global dollar.
When Captain America throws his mighty shield.
Why is that important? Well, because the dollar is used as the world's reserve currency. It offers higher interest rates than other currencies. It's stable, it's trusted, and everyone wants it. So when we go shopping on the global market, we don't really need to worry about whether we have enough gold bars in the vault or if we're exporting enough soybeans and jet engines. We throw that Captain America shield out, and most of the time, it works. But even superpowers can't ignore a growing trade deficit forever, especially as debt piles up and other countries start to question the value of that shield. So how long has the US had a trade deficit?
And basically since the 1980s, so for a very long time.
My fellow Americans, despite a growing trade deficit, we've gained over 7.5 million new jobs since 1980.
What has varied is the size of that trade deficit. It got big in the early 1980s, it shrank. It got big in the late 1990s.
And, our major trade deficit in the world, except for our oil imports, has been with Japan. And of course now with China and other countries in Asia combined.
It got even bigger in the early 2000s before the global financial crisis. It shrank.
It is true that this crisis included failures by lenders and borrowers, by financial firms, by governments and independent regulators. But the crisis was not a failure of the free market system.
And now it's big again. There are different ways of measuring it. The way I would tend to measure it puts it, counting goods and services, puts it at over 4% of GDP. That's relatively big. I wouldn't worry so much about a 2% of GDP trade deficit. But we're back at 4% of GDP. And the amount of interest that we're paying on our external debt is going up.
For context, the US is running a trade deficit equivalent to 1% of the world's GDP, which is huge.
Now, it's offset by the fact that our companies make a lot of money abroad. But even with that extra profit we earn abroad, we're starting to make net payments to the world in dividends and interest, largely because we're paying more interest. But yeah, look, it isn't healthy that the bulk of the world's trade deficit is now found in the United States. It isn't healthy that we've basically run trade deficits of decent size for most of the past 30 years. It isn't healthy that our external debt is going up and that our external interest payments are going up. There's a set of indicators that one would look at and say, hey, maybe we should change a little bit. And since the trade deficit in the US, the main counterpart of that, the main reason why we're borrowing from the world in aggregate is not a really high level of investment. It's a really big fiscal deficit. You might say that's not the best reason to be borrowing from the rest of the world. So I do think there's a basis for concern, but not a basis for panic.
Is this a distinctly US thing, or does every country have some level of a deficit?
No, by definition, the world economy has to be balanced. Despite Elon Musk's best efforts, we don't currently trade with Mars. And it's going to be a long time before we trade with Mars, and it's going to be really expensive. So if the U.S. is running a deficit, someone else is running a surplus. And, right now, I think the big issue for the world economy is that most of the world's deficit is found in the United States. If I want to be perfectly accurate, I would say most of the world's deficit is found in the US, the United Kingdom, India, and Turkey.
As Brad alluded to, following the United States, India has the second largest global trade deficit at over $26 billion as of this April.
And that means most countries around the world are running surpluses. Most countries around the world are exporting more than they import. Most countries around the world have had, over the past few years, some trouble generating internal demand, particularly in Asia.
Which country do we have the biggest trade deficit with?
It's a trick question, right? Because you're moving to bilateral balances. How much do we export with country A compared to how much we import from country A?
Most economists prefer to look at the trade deficit as an aggregate, as a global lump sum. But the trade deficit can also be looked at as the trade relationship between two countries, aka bilateral trade.
Up until now, I've been talking about the overall trade deficit. And if you want to ask which countries in the world run the biggest overall trade surpluses, not just with the US, but with the world, the biggest surplus is clearly in China. Not even close. Right? We have over $1 trillion deficit. China in aggregate has a surplus of over $1 trillion. And the big change in the global economy has been that more of the surplus is now found in China than 5 years ago, and more of the surplus is now found in East Asia. Less of the surplus globally is found in the oil exporting economies.
Countries that primarily export oil, like Saudi Arabia and Russia, used to have large surpluses because oil was in high demand throughout the early 2000s into the 2010s. And prices were especially lofty after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Now, as global trade has shifted from oil dominant to manufacturing dominant, these countries share a smaller portion of the world's surplus, and titans like China have come out on top.
If you just look at bilateral trade, how much we directly trade with any given country, I think Mexico has overtaken China. Now, that's a little deceptive because Mexico's overall trade is pretty balanced. Mexico doesn't run a big surplus in aggregate. But because of Mexico's pattern of trade, it runs a decent-sized surplus with the U.S. Because of the tariffs that were introduced in Trump's first term, direct trade with the U.S. and China is down. And a lot of Chinese goods are exported to Vietnam, to Taiwan, to Thailand, to the Philippines, to Malaysia, and then they're assembled and sent to the U.S. The other big U.S. deficits are found with Vietnam, strangely with Ireland, with Germany, with Japan, with Korea. We run a trade surplus with Brazil. Pretty big trade surplus, actually, with Brazil. Brazil structurally actually competes with us in a lot of third country markets for agricultural exports. But because Brazil and the US Midwest are both agricultural superpowers, we don't trade much with each other. So the bilateral trade data will miss more complicated trading patterns. We don't tend to buy much from Brazil, and we sell Brazil planes, agricultural equipment. So you can get a distorted picture just looking at bilateral trade.
Along with Brazil, Australia also runs a trade deficit with the US. And if you take oil out of the picture, Canada actually has a trade deficit with the US in manufacturing. But since the United States runs arguably one of the largest trade deficits, in total, we end up running trade deficits with most countries around the world. So, Trump paints the trade deficit as other countries having an unfair advantage over us. Has he been steadfast in this perspective? Has he always been fixated on this?
It's really interesting that one of the first ways Trump kind of comes to the larger public eye outside the New York real estate scene is that he gets very active in the 80s and I think already in the 70s protesting what he sees at the time as the unfairness of US-Japan trade.
We let Japan come in and dump everything right into our markets and everything. It's not free trade. If you ever go to Japan right now and try to sell something, forget about it, Oprah. Just forget about it. It's almost impossible.
And in some ways, some of the core things he says now, you could take out Japan and slot in China, Vietnam, Germany, and it's basically the same line. And he's not alone in this, by the way. There is a generation of folks whose mindset on trade was founded in the 50s, really, when US manufacturing power just astonishingly outstrips the rest of the world, in large part because we hadn't had a war on our territory in the 40s. And that, not coincidentally, is a moment where you can run a family on one manufacturing job. So one manufacturing wage earner gives you enough money to have a house, maybe have a little boat, go on vacations, send your kids to college, or importantly, get your son's jobs in the factory at 18. And it's that vision of the social order, which didn't hold for all that many people, really only hold for white men and wasn't so great for everyone. But it's that vision of the social order that many of Trump's policies in many areas harken back to.
What does it mean exactly for our economy to be less resilient because of the trade deficit? According to many economists and experts, the U.S. could face longer periods of recession and reliance on foreign suppliers. Americans would be hit with shortages and subsequently high inflation, and there would be less investment in technology and development. But as we learned, the consequences aren't zero-sum, and the domino effect of current trade and tariff policy, intended to shrink the trade deficit and help the U.S. economy, could do just the opposite. So, where do we go from here? Is the impact to our economy and trade relationships able to be minimized? What does the future look like?
My answer is different from what it would have been 6 months ago, because the US remains one of the world's two largest economies, one of the most desired places to invest, and a regulatory system that most of the rest of the world looks at and says, yeah, I'd love to put my money there. And we had an economy, frankly, up until earlier this year that was the envy of the rest of the world, that had recovered much faster from COVID than others. Now, with the tariffs, introduce tremendous uncertainty, and that does a couple things. One, it has knocked down the dollar relative to other global currencies, which should help U.S. exports by making them less expensive. So if you're spending US dollars, you buy more of a thing now than if you're spending some other country's currency. So that should help. On the other hand, our manufacturing is really interlinked with everybody else's in the world. Can you get the materials you need here to manufacture? What is it going to look like in 6 weeks? You see the bond market's uncertain. Is this a good place to invest anymore? Should we be buying dollars? Should we be buying euros instead? And you're starting to have real questions about the quality of our regulatory market and our justice system here at home. So frankly, I'm worried that our economy will be a lot less resilient than we have grown used to it being in the past.
What do you think is missing from top-level discussions of the trade deficit?
Yeah, look, what I think has been often overlooked has everything to do with incentives in tax codes that allow companies to avoid tax by producing often outside the United States. So one of our biggest trade deficits is in pharmaceuticals. We have a lot of good companies that produce and do the R&D and have invented some of the world's best drugs. But because of the way the US tax code is set up now, the net effect is that we end up importing a lot of pharmaceuticals. So Ireland, Singapore, Switzerland, they're not low-cost countries, they're low-tax countries. And that those countries account for the bulk of our trade deficit in pharmaceuticals.
So how do you solve that problem?
Change our tax code, our corporate tax code. I do think that the distortions associated with Ireland's tax system and with our own tax system, ultimately we fix this not by changing Ireland's tax, but by changing our own tax, have become so big that you can no longer ignore it. It just, at some point, something becomes a little out of control. And the tax avoidance through Ireland tax avoidance incentivized and caused not just by Ireland's tax, but by our own tax system, has gotten out of control.
In recent months, Ireland has accounted for 40 to 50% of the United States' total trade deficit with Europe, largely due to exports from its booming pharmaceutical industry. And there's no question why. Ireland currently has a 12.5% corporate tax rate, which is nearly half of the US's, which stands at 21%. But there is a new deal in the works to reform this issue. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has proposed a global tax reform deal, which aims to establish a global minimum corporate tax rate. This would attempt to balance global tax revenues after companies around the world have largely shifted profits to low-tax regions. However, on Trump's first day back in office, he issued an executive order rejecting the international initiative.
Our biggest bilateral trade deficit with any European country now is with Ireland. It's not with Germany. It sounds crazy.
It does.
But little Ireland has become this huge tax center because of this crazy pharmaceutical trade to get in ahead of the tariffs in the first quarter. Like our imports of pharmaceuticals from Ireland in 1 month are normally like 5, 6, 7 billion. In 1 month, they were $27 billion just from Ireland alone. This 1 month jump has had an impact on U.S. overall GDP growth, reported GDP growth, on Euro area reported GDP growth. And there's just, for a whole range of global statistics, you kind of need to exclude Ireland to get an accurate picture.
So I'm going to throw the why it matters at you. Why does the trade deficit matter to everyday Americans? Does it come down to jobs, taxes? What is it?
I mean, if you're a consumer, the fact that we run relatively large trade deficits has enabled us as a country to get access to a lot of goods cheaply, and it has increased a lot of people's living standards. The fact that we don't export that much, that exports as a share of our GDP are a little small compared to the rest of the world, that means that there are fewer jobs in sectors of the economy that trade a lot. And one sector that trades a lot, where we're not doing as well as we used to do, is agriculture. It means fewer manufacturing jobs. Not a lot, but because we run a trade deficit in manufacturers, because we import without exporting as much, we don't have as many of the high-paying export jobs as you might expect. And there's not a lot of them. But if we were going to get rid of the trade deficit in a healthy way, not just by bringing down our imports, but by growing our exports, we would have more jobs making computer chips, more jobs making pharmaceuticals. Boeing would have to make more planes. Generally, we make more aircraft engines. We make more gas turbines. We make more big diesel engines. There's a bunch of parts of the U.S. economy which would be bigger if we had a smaller trade deficit. So for those parts of the economy, it's fewer jobs. For everyone, as I mentioned earlier, the trade deficit is a reflection of foreign demand for our bonds. So to some degree, it's keeping borrowing costs in the U.S. a little lower than they would be without the inflow of money into the U.S. And so therefore, it impacts the cost at which the U.S. government borrows. Now, you can say that's a good thing. Hey, why pay more to borrow? Or you can say it's a bad thing. It's made it too easy for the U.S. government to borrow, too easy for the U.S. government to run big deficits. And that has led us down the road to temptation. And it has taken away pressure for us to bring our fiscal deficits into balance. And then I think you can say generally, as a society, we're running a bit of a risk just because our external debt has gotten to be kind of big. And when your external debt is kind of big, the risk is that you're going to all of a sudden no longer going to be able to afford all these imports. You're going to have to just become a society that exports to pay off your debt rather than exporting to bring goods in. So I think there's a set of reasons why people should care.
For resources used in this episode and more information, visit cfr.org/whyitmatters and take a look at the show notes. If you ever have any questions or suggestions or just want to chat with us, email at whyitmatters@cfr.org, or you can hit us up on X at CFR_org. Why It Matters is a production of the Council on Foreign Relations. The opinions expressed on the show are solely that of the guests, not of CFR, which takes no institutional positions on matters of policy. This episode was produced by Molly McEnany and me, Gabrielle Sierra. Our sound designer is Marcus Zacharia. Robert McMahon is our managing editor. Our theme music is composed by Carrie Torhuson. You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your audio. For Why It Matters, this is Gabrielle Sierra signing off. See you soon.
It's America's game.
You know everything that had to happen for that to happen?
Welcome to the show, everyone, and today, let's talk about deals. Specifically, trade deals. As President Trump continues to raise and implement tariffs on everyone from our adversaries to our allies, it's become even more important to know what trade agreements we currently have so that we know which are up for renegotiation. We're at a crucial moment, one that could potentially reorient or at least fundamentally shift the path of global trade. This could change the way the world looks at U.S. trade policy. It could push allies to trade with adversaries, and even lead to a recession on par with the Great Depression. As CFR President and former Trade Representative Michael Froman said in the World This Week newsletter, "Uncertainty is upon us." That lack of certainty now extends to trade deals, one of the pillars of global trade coveted by many U.S. partners. I'm Gabrielle Sierra, and this is Why It Matters. Today, we continue with our special series, Unpacking Global Trade. So, spin the wheel, because when it comes to trade agreements, there's no telling where the ball will land. Inu, friend of the pod, welcome back to Why It Matters.
It is fantastic to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
This is Inu Manik. She's a fellow for trade policy here at CFR. Inu has been chronicling Trump's trade war, paying especially close attention to global trade deals. All right, let's dive straight in here. What is a trade agreement?
Well, a trade agreement is a basic agreement between two or more countries about how to regulate their trade and also sometimes their investment relationship with each other. It can include rules on lowering tariff barriers. It could include rules on cooperating on regulations, such as standards like crash tests for vehicles or the ingredients in your sunscreen. And it also includes things like intellectual property, environmental, and labor rules too. So a lot can go in there. And they're really important to have these. And it's some of the ways that we sort of figure out how to create a stable relationship between the partners involved and create some predictability in what they're trading with each other. So overall, trade agreements benefit the economy because they allow for lower cost inputs for producers and greater choice for consumers.
And then what is a free trade agreement? Are there like non-free trade agreements?
Well, a free trade agreement basically reduces barriers to what we call substantially all trade. This means that they're comprehensive deals. So they'll cover things from industrial products to agriculture to all sorts of other things we trade, like services too.
The United States actually only has 14 free trade agreements with 20 countries. And there are three main ways these trade agreements are negotiated. One, a multilateral trade agreement. This is an agreement between many countries, and these are designed to benefit everyone, even those not included in the agreement itself. Two, a plurilateral trade agreement. This is an agreement involving 3 or more countries. These agreements lower barriers for just those in the agreement, no one outside of it. And 3, a bilateral trade agreement. This is the most typical of the agreements, and you've probably heard about these the most. It involves trade deals between two countries. It is also called the Preferential Trade Agreement. And as Inu said, these cover more than just trade. They can touch on everything from foreign investment to intellectual property rights. Therefore, they can influence labor standards, environmental regulations, and even e-commerce rules. We're saying countries, but that feels pretty broad. Who exactly is making these agreements?
The U.S. Trade Representative is the chief trade negotiator. This is a role that's a political appointment from the president, and then he is confirmed by Congress to serve in that role. And we have other agencies that get involved in the trade negotiation process, depending on whether the issue that is being covered there touches their area of expertise. And then most importantly, other than Congress, you have all the outside stakeholders in, the US public. So you're talking about businesses, associations, regional groupings, and then individual consumers who can all play a role in shaping trade policy. So it's a really all of country effort to actually negotiate a trade agreement. And you kind of don't know what the impact's going to be or what you should be doing unless you talk to people, figure out how it affects them, because you can't do it after the fact, because you could have some pretty unintended consequences if you do it that way.
Is this the way it's always been, or have things evolved as time has passed?
If you look at the history of tariff delegation and trade authority delegation to the president, Congress basically gave a lot of its authority away in the 30s in response to what was a huge protectionist action that Congress itself initiated. The infamous Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which are mentioned in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, one of my favorite films of all time.
Did it work? Anyone? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression.
Congress essentially had this huge tariff hike. They realized it was a big mistake, and they wanted to roll it back, but they also recognized that they had to kind of give away some of their power and delegate it to the president, who, unlike Congress, has a national constituency.
In theory, this felt like a more democratic system, because the president answers to everyone, whereas Congress can be influenced by lobbying in their specific districts.
But Congress is something else too, and we see this ratchet up a little bit more during the Cold War, that they give the president a lot more authority to actually address economic issues that may be related to national security concerns. Now, in the past, the norm has been that you kind of have to be very careful in how you use these tools, right? That you should only really use these tools when there is a legitimate national security concern, and that's when you would take action. But what we've seen in the last 8 years, in fact, is that these tools have been used quite a bit for things that have nothing to do with national security. I think that that's where there's been a big change, and it was a change that was never intended by Congress.
One of the tools Inu is talking about is known as IEEPA, or the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. This grants the president sweeping economic power during an emergency. Most recently, we saw President Trump use IEEPA to deploy 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico to stem the flow of fentanyl over the border. Trade experts call this the, quote, nuclear weapon of trade, because very little can be done to stop the president from using it.
President Trump did this in his first term with tariffs on steel and aluminum, and he's done that now again in his second term with tariffs on automobiles and blanket tariffs on Canada and Mexico and China as well in the name of national security. So yes, the president can do a lot when he claims national security is the issue.
Let's get further into that realm, actually. So you've become CFR's sort of, can he do that person? So let's play a quick game, if you will, of can he do that? So I'm going to ask you some rapid fire questions about what the president can and cannot do when it comes to trade. Here we go. Can the president unilaterally arrange or renegotiate trade agreements?
Technically, the president can ask to renegotiate a trade agreement, but if it has gone through Congress for approval, Congress then needs to approve any changes that he makes to it.
Can the president withdraw from an existing trade agreement without Congress?
So existing trade agreements that have been approved by Congress, the president can't unilaterally withdraw from them. He can basically threaten to withdraw, as President Trump has done, but at the end of the day, he needs Congress on his side.
Can the president direct the U.S. trade representative in trade negotiations?
Absolutely. So the president sets the trade policy agenda, and he gets to decide what his administration wants to pursue. And so he can tell the trade representative what his priorities are and then get him to go ahead and negotiate those.
Can the president unilaterally impose tariffs without approval from Congress?
Unfortunately, yes. The president has a lot of authority to set tariff rates without Congress. The president has a lot of discretion to do a lot of things in trade, not just tariffs, but like export controls, meaning you're restricting things that are exiting the country, and he has a way to apply other sanctions as well.
Okay, and finally, this one is really a can they do that? Can the judiciary and or Congress retroactively veto executive trade orders?
Absolutely. So Congress has the ultimate authority when it comes to regulating trade with countries. Congress could have a vote and take away the president's authority. They could narrow the scope of what he could do, and they can repeal some of his actions as well. The courts can do this too. We have several court cases already that have been filed against President Trump's recent actions, and the courts can also reverse a lot of those decisions. But again, they tend to be very discretionary about doing this and let the president do a lot of what he wants to do if it entails national security.
Well, you've won. The game was rigged because you knew all the answers, but you've won this spot on Why It Matters. And let's see, a Council on Foreign Relations pencil, a World Next Week mug, anything I can see in my line of sight, it's yours for running us through this quickly and efficiently.
Could definitely use a new mug and maybe a pencil too. So thank you.
So let's transition from can he do that to President Trump specifically. What effect has he had on all of this?
President Trump has really shifted, in many ways, the approach to trade. Typically, when the president wants to pursue a certain trade policy, he will come up with a bit of a plan, ask Congress for what's called trade promotion authority, which allows him to submit agreements to Congress for an up or down vote. So they wouldn't make amendments to it when it's submitted. The reason you would do that is because why would a trading partner negotiate something if it would be changed by Congress later? So it's an important innovation in U.S. trade policy to do this. So what we've seen in the last 8 years is that we really haven't seen a good use of trade promotion authority, with the exception of the renegotiation of the USMCA, which fell under trade promotion authority from the previous administration, the Obama administration. That expired in 2021 and has never been renewed. The importance of trade promotion authority is that Congress basically sets objectives for the president and priorities based on all the different interests of folks around the country. And then the president has to basically try to figure out how to square those and then negotiate those deals with whoever he wants to negotiate and then submit them to Congress. So it's really important that Congress is involved and then stakeholders involved throughout the process. What we're seeing today is quite different.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day. Waiting for a long time. In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world. Reciprocal, that means they do it to us and we do it to them. Very simple.
Because the president is using his executive authority and issuing proclamations and executive orders to regulate trade, he's doing this without that consultative process. Congress doesn't know about what he's going to do until he does it. In fact, for President Trump, his cabinet doesn't know what he's going to do until he does it and announces on Truth Social. This is really ad hoc trade policy making, which is unlike anything we've really seen before. And most importantly, it's the transparency that's really shifted in sort of modern trade policy making, that we don't really have the involvement, not just of Congress, but all the other stakeholders that are impacted by this. We're talking about U.S. businesses and consumers expert groups, all of those folks who have an important role to play in shaping a trade policy that benefits all of the country instead of just a select few. So I would say that's the biggest thing that we've seen shift. But in addition to that, we just don't see President Trump and even President Biden having engaged in some of the international institutions like the World Trade Organization, where we typically would negotiate like big treaties, among a big set of countries. And so traditional institutions, whether they be multilateral or those plurilateral or bilateral, we're just not engaging in them in the same way anymore.
Sort of become a move fast, break things attitude for a area of focus that I'm sure you did not expect to take on that pace.
Absolutely. I mean, trade negotiations are long and boring, right? They take a really long time to think up like the structure of what you're going to negotiate. There's so much prep with the negotiators to figure out like how they're going to sort out the trade-offs between the things. Like they usually come up with a list of things they're going to concede, things that they want from each other. And it's a back and forth, right? So it's a cooperative sort of discussion that you have. And what we're seeing today is, hey, you do this. Otherwise, we're going to hit tariffs on you. That's really not traditionally how you think about trade negotiations at all. It's sort of like negotiating with a gun to your head, and whoever wants to do that.
Okay, so he's upsetting norms and changing things sort of all on his own. Congress doesn't really seem to be stopping him, at least as of now. So what are the most important agreements that we should really be keeping an eye on?
I think the most important agreement to keep an eye on right now is the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. That was the agreement that used to be NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which President Trump renegotiated in his first term. Now, the reason it's important is because it's up for review next year, but the Trump administration has decided to sort of kick off that process already for renegotiating it. Now, why are we potentially renegotiating or reviewing it? USMCA has a provision in it called a sunset clause that basically requires the agreement to be reviewed after 6 years from its entry into force, which is 2026. And if the parties can't decide to continue it, then it expires in 16 years. So it would just poof, disappear in 2036 if they did not agree to it. Now, it's really important because Canada and Mexico are our two most important trading partners. We trade a tremendous amount with them every single minute crossing our border. We build cars with them. We have an integrated energy infrastructure. They're really critical trading partners. So this is why this agreement is so important. And so this is going to be up for review. And what happens to that, how narrow that review is, how broad it is, will really have an impact on the day-to-day lives of many Americans, including their gas prices and the vegetables that they buy at the supermarket. The second thing I would pay attention to is what happens at the World Trade Organization. Now, I know it's not really a cool thing to talk about anymore. The WTO is kind of like yesterday's news.
Anymore? Was it cool like back when? And
well, maybe it's cool to me, but I am definitely a trade nerd, and I just love talking about institutions. But the WTO is still doing a lot of stuff. And one actually important thing that the Trump administration will probably be interested in are the rules it's been negotiating for quite some time on digital trade. So when you open up iTunes or Spotify, that's a digital trade. There are digitally delivered services that you can get. Let's say you're using some sort of software that helps you communicate with someone around the world, or you make a phone call with someone, a Zoom call with someone who's helping you maybe style your hair. That's a digitally delivered service because you're actually not physically meeting that person.
Interesting, yeah.
Now, the US is a global leader in the digital trade landscape. We have tons of tech companies that are really interested in ensuring that the rules of digital trade reflect US interests and priorities. And if we're not there in Geneva stirring those conversations, then it may not reflect what's in the best interest of US companies. So I think that's an instance where we may actually get that deal over the finish line next year when the WTO countries meet to finalize this. So let's see what happens, but I do think that'll be an interesting one to watch.
Let's talk briefly about tariffs. We've done a lot on tariffs. Everyone knows a lot on tariffs. I mean, I was at a brunch this weekend with a friend of mine who's an interior designer, and suddenly we're sitting there talking about tariffs. It feels like Tariffs are everywhere, and we've also gone through a bit of tariff whiplash. So why do you think tariffs are the tool of choice for Trump?
It's a great question. And honestly, I personally apologize for everyone having to talk about tariffs on their wonderful Sunday brunches. Like, that sounds like an awful brunch. But, you know, tariffs are really in vogue again. They haven't been in vogue for a really long time in the United States. And President Trump really likes tariffs. He's called tariff the most beautiful word in the English language. And he said over and over again that he just likes tariffs. So I don't think it's more complicated than that, to be honest. I don't think he has any sort of grand strategic vision for how to use them or thinks a lot about how they can be used more effectively, because all the tariffs that he's put in place have been really blunt instruments, particularly the ones that he levied against Canada and Mexico, our closest trading partners, which basically affect us quite a bit. And so that's something that I think has not been really thought through. Now, I don't think any trade expert would ever counsel any president to impose blanket tariffs on all imports at all, or even against any country. But let me just say one important thing that I think we should keep in mind, and I think maybe why trade is such a popular topic now, and tariffs are the subject of a lot of personal conversations. You know, the way of thinking about tariffs as a tool, it's kind of out of step with the reality of trade today. Take an iconic product like the Ford F-150. You know, this is like your American truck. You can't get more American than this.
F-Series, America's best-selling trucks for 47 years straight. There are so many reasons why.
In addition to the American labor components, Ford relies on a lot of foreign parts to make the F-150. About 1/3 of all the parts in that truck are from abroad. And then it's sold in the United States and to countries around the world. Now, U.S. firms that trade in goods also support half of all the jobs in the U.S. economy. And almost 3/4 of those jobs come from firms that both export and import products. A lot of our economic value comes from firms that trade. And this is something that is really impacted by tariffs if you increase them.
It seems like the response to this is to put things on hold. Are you finding that things are just sort of being put on hold until the decisions become clearer, things level out?
Yeah, I mean, I think some firms are thinking about how they can just wait on long-term decisions until they figure out where this is going to all land. Because at the moment, President Trump has ordered his cabinet to essentially go out and negotiate a bunch of trade deals with our foreign partners. And some folks are just going to wait this out and see what happens. Now, the reality also is that even if you're like a big company like Walmart, you can't hold on to that much inventory for that long, right? So eventually, stuff is going to run out and the shelves are going to go empty. And that might start happening pretty soon. But even if you're a small business, that's even a much more challenging situation to be in, because I doubt you're stockpiling in your house if you're running a business out of your house, or if you have a small shop, there's very little you can do there. You're not going to buy in big volumes because that's going to be a cost you're going to have to eat up front that you may not be able to afford. And so it pushes you into making these very difficult decisions about your business. And for some folks, it means closing up shop, laying off workers, and we already have seen some layoffs percolate down the economy. The thing is, this approach where we're basically slapping a big tariff on, forcing people to the negotiating table, and then trying to make them accept things that they don't want to accept, what that's going to do in the long term for the United States is actually erode its soft power. Because basically, you're not really going to want to trust the United States anymore if you're willing to rip up old agreements and also just be kind of a bully when it comes to negotiating new ones. So I think for our trading partners, even those who are willing to come to the table and negotiate, I mean, they're doing that because they appreciate their relationship with the United States.
Recently, Trump struck what the White House called a, quote, historic trade deal with longtime trading partner, the UK.
With this deal, the UK joins the United States in affirming that reciprocity and fairness is an essential and vital principle of international trade.
However, experts say the agreement significantly undercuts what the United States could have attained through traditional trade agreements. Trump's universal 10% reciprocal tariff still remains on everything not specifically spared in the deal.
meaning the effective US tariff on goods remains much higher than it was before Liberation Day. Not long after the UK deal, the US and China reached a temporary 90-day agreement, mutually reducing tariffs by 115%. But, as it is with many of the trade deals Trump is trying to carve out, uncertainty still looms for business owners, investors, and the American people. The 90-day duration of the US-China agreement and the early stage of the UK negotiations still leave room for potential changes.
A lot of these are long in economic integration partnerships that we've had, and they respect not just the United States, but the American people, and they want to have a deal with all of us. So I think that's why they're showing up. But at the end of the day, they have their own interests, and they have to sell that agreement back home too. So they have to make sure that the deal is balanced. And I think right now, what they're seeing when they look at the United States, it's sort of like, that friend that you're always making plans with for dinner, and then they never show up, or they bail on you at the last minute.
Flaky.
It's just always changing. Yeah, very flaky. You cannot predict. And so what happens over time with that friend? You're just either not going to invite them to things, and you'll go and negotiate or hang out with other people on your own, or you'll basically invite them with the expectation they're just not going to be there. And you'll just be disappointed every time if you expect them to show up. So I think it's a fundamental change to the way the rest of the world sees us. And that should be really concerning.
Yeah. Oh, God. No one wants to be the flaky friend.
Oh, no. I never am the flaky friend.
No,
I always
same.
show up exactly when I mean to.
Okay. So as we wrap up, what do you say to those who feel like we should have fewer trade agreements and really focus on making everything here, right? Keeping our goods and services all local so we can save American jobs?
The impact of trade agreements on an economy are really complex, and they can vary a lot. So overall, trade agreements benefit the economy because they allow for lower cost inputs for producers and greater choice for consumers. But trade agreements also lead to a lot of competition, right? Because you open your market, then you have all these other products coming in and all these other services coming in. And so some sectors of the economy may not be able to compete as effectively with this new competition. But technological innovation, such as automation and then gains from productivity, also lead to job losses. And that's not because of trade. In fact, manufacturing employment has been declining since the 1970s, well before China actually entered the global economy. And the rate of decline in the US mirrors that of other high-income countries, like Germany, for example, which is a manufacturing powerhouse. As countries get richer, they tend to shift employment from manufacturing to the services sector. And that's sort of what we've seen here. But the jobs that get reallocated, they have to go somewhere, right? And the challenge is that it's often very difficult for some people to find other jobs. So the distribution of the gains from trade can be unequal. And trade agreements can't solve for that. That's something that we actually need to solve and should solve with domestic policy. This includes things like worker training programs to help people get new skills, supporting folks that want to go to college and can't pay for it, or want to go to technical school so they can learn a new skill. But then also, when you think about it, more affordable housing so you can move somewhere like in the city, you can get a job, and lower healthcare costs. Healthcare costs that can be lower so you can get up and move and you don't have to worry about losing your health insurance at your job. So I think we hear a lot of anecdotes about trade-induced job losses, and those anecdotes really stick because they put a face to things. That's not to say this isn't a problem. I think it's a really big problem, and we need to find better ways to help these people at home find better jobs. And we shouldn't just be thinking about this in terms of the shocks of trade, but the shocks of an open, competitive economy. We need to find a way to make the whole U.S. workforce, not just those affected by trade, much more competitive across the board. And that means investing in Americans, helping them get their skills up, helping them get the education that they want, and lowering their costs of living so they can choose to live how they want.
Well, thank you so much, Inu. So appreciate you joining us and walking us through all of this.
It was great to be here today.
Stay tuned because next week we have a special live Why It Matters episode coming your way. And to continue with Why It Matters tradition, here are our wonderful interns from this semester to read us out. Take it away, guys.
Thanks, Gabby. For resources used in this episode and more information, visit cfr.org/why it matters and take a look at the show notes. If you ever have any questions or suggestions or just want to chat with us, email at whyitmatters@cfr.org, or you can hit us up on X at @CFR_org.
Why It Matters is a production of the Council on Foreign Relations. The opinions expressed on the show are solely that of the guests, not of CFR, which takes no institutional position on matters of policy.
This episode was produced by Molly McEnany and Gabrielle Sierra. Our sound designer is Marcus Zachariah. Our interns this semester are me, Isabella Hassar.
And me, Joe Strogatz. Robert McMahon is our managing editor. Our theme music is composed by Carrie Torhuson.
You can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your audio. For Why It Matters, this is Isabella.
And this is Joe. Signing off.
See you later!